Roy Orbison's 25-year-old wife tragically died in a motorcycle crash. But few know the shocking link between her cause of death and Elvis Presley. The rock scene of the 1950s and early 1960s was full of artists who exuded traditional masculinity. But among them all, Roy Orbison rose through the ranks. In attitude, Orbison was shy and self-conscious, albeit a little egotistic. However, through his music, he portrayed a unique vulnerability that turned him into an inspiration for so many, even through the tragedies that plagued his life. Many in the music industry have held Roy Orbison's unique creativity in high esteem. Despite his extensive journey from relative obscurity, he was born on April 23, 1936 in Vernon, Texas, to a family coming off the Great Depression. Although his father worked as an oil field driller when he could, his mother, Nadine Vesta Schultz, enjoyed more creative endeavors such as poetry and painting, undoubtedly influencing Roy's artistic spirit. This didn't mean his father was unhappy about his son's interest, though. While Roy's father, Orby Lee Orbison, had to focus on finding work, he still found time to encourage his son's musical beginnings. At 6 years old, Roy received a guitar from his father for his birthday and took to it like a fish to water. Over the years, Roy would learn to play from his father and older brother. However, it wasn't just any kind of music he was playing. Growing up in Texas, it wasn't hard to predict what genre of music would speak to Roy the most. As he learned guitar and cultivated his talent, he became more attracted to country music, specifically Western swing. Musicians like Jimmy Rogers, Hank Williams, and especially Lefty Frizzle's vocal talents left quite an impact on Roy, and soon his love of music would pay off. Roy had an inherent aptitude for singing and playing guitar, which those who heard him seemed to recognize early on. At only 9 years old, while living with his grandmother in Texas, he won a contest with the KVWC radio station. As a result, they gave him a weekly radio show on which he sang a regular set list of songs. However, not every aspect of growing up was easy for Roy. There was something that he seriously struggled with. Unfortunately, Roy never seemed to have a high view of himself and spent most of his time alone because of it. His naturally gray hair and thick glasses made him uncomfortable about his appearance and shy around others. Even when it came to his singing, he thought he was average at best, even though everyone greatly admired his talent. Still, this didn't stop him from pursuing his dream. Finally, Roy found a group of people to join him on the path to show business. In 1949, he enlisted several school friends to create a band called the Wink Westerners, playing Western swing music in bars and on the radio. After the group received $400 to play a local school dance, Roy realized that music could be a legitimate career. He then made a significant change. From the moment he received a guitar as a child, Roy not only became talented with the instrument, but was intent on performing mainly as a guitar player. However, by the time he was 15, he realized that he enjoyed singing much more and decided to focus on his voice, allowing the guitar to serve more as an accessory. Of course, music wasn't the only thing in his life at the time. While Roy may have dreamed of becoming a musician, times were hard, and he knew he would need a backup if things didn't go his way. Following in his father's footsteps, Roy thought working in the oil fields would be a good idea on top of enrolling at North Texas State College to study geology in 1954. However, this didn't last forever. Following Roy's first year in college, he still performed with the Wink Westerners, but remained conflicted between education and music. This started to change when he heard that his friend Pat Boone was living his dream and had signed with a record label. Suddenly, the concept of becoming a professional musician seemed more real than ever before. Following this, he made another big decision. By 1955, Roy's time with the Wink Westerners had ended, and the band dissolved. This came shortly after he switched colleges, but these new surroundings brought new opportunities. Roy joined two of his former bandmates, James Morrow and Billy Pat Ellis, in creating a new group called the Teen Kings, which also brought on two new faces, and it wasn't long before they got some traction. Using a song written by a couple of Roy's other college friends, the Teen Kings recorded Ooby Dooby and published it under a startup label in 1956. Roy wasn't satisfied, however, and the band eventually paid back the company's production costs in exchange for the freedom to find a bigger label. This paved the way for even bigger achievements. A couple of months after their first recording of Ooby Dooby, the Teen Kings connected with a more prominent label. While the details of how they became associated with Sun Records are foggy, they quickly flew to Memphis, Tennessee to re-record their single with the new studio. Soon after, the head of Sun Records, Sam Phillips, signed the band on. Around this time, Roy started experiencing a shift. As Roy continued with the Teen Kings and Sun Records, he moved away from the Western swing genre that got him started. Even beyond what Phillips wanted for him, which was to emulate the rockabilly style of Elvis Presley, Roy longed to transition towards slower and more passionate ballads, but there was even more trouble on the horizon. Playing alongside some of the biggest names in country, such as Carl Perkins and Johnny Cash, the Teen Kings still found themselves declining. What little money the band was making wasn't enough to support them, and it grew increasingly harder for the rest of the band to work with Roy. With some of the bands even calling him egomaniacal, eventually things reached a breaking point. Roy may have thought he was the star, but he wasn't the only one, and his ego was only boosted by the producers around him. This became evident when his bandmates learned of a plan to change their name to Roy Orbison and the Teen Kings, prompting everyone but Roy to walk out. It wasn't long after this, in December 1956, that the Teen Kings disbanded. Unfortunately, Roy was not better off. Like the rest of his former bandmates, Roy hadn't received much from the Teen Kings' music, but it got worse when everyone else quit. In the immediate aftermath of the breakups, Sun Records wasn't sure what to do with Roy as a solo artist, so his financials suffered. Not wanting to give up, he instead turned to performing on the road. Still, he eventually made another attempt. Having spent a few months away from the studio, Roy again tried to establish himself as a solo recording artist. Returning to Sun Records in mid-1957, he recorded a collection of songs with only his voice and an acoustic guitar. Regrettably, the music industry is fickle, and every song of his failed. This made him realize that being a recording artist was not in the cards. But though there were dark clouds rolling in, he still managed to hit a few professional milestones. Moving away from music production, Roy relocated to Odessa, Texas, that fall with his now 16-year-old girlfriend, Claudette. He had met her several years prior, and the two married shortly after. The following year, in 1958, Claudette gave birth to their first son. Roy, on the professional side, however, was not enthused. While Roy had no desire to record any further music, part of him would always stay connected to the industry. So while in Texas, he continued performing in various venues, until even that lost its intrigue, and he stopped in 1958. While he stopped recording and performing, he hadn't finished with all musical endeavors. Roy had become disillusioned with many aspects of the music industry, but he still enjoyed writing music. Over the next years, he worked for a music firm focused around writing country songs for other musical artists. While at this firm, he forged a relationship with producer Wesley Rose, to whom Roy would send his demos to. This soon proved to be invaluable. After a year of working for the firm, Roy stumbled into another opportunity for a music career. Wesley Rose, who had listened to Roy's demos for the past year, suggested the musician's name to Fred Foster of Monument Records. The following year, in 1960, Roy signed with the label, and now he could finally return to the recording booth. Roy spent many hours writing songs with singer Joe Melson, and after signing to Monument Records, the two wrote Only the Lonely, which included several innovative aspects compared to his usual music. It had doo-wop background singers and strings, and Roy even sang falsetto. Thankfully, this gamble wasn't for nothing. Roy wasn't unemployed, but struggled to provide for his family at least before he and Joe Melson wrote their new song. After Roy recorded Only the Lonely, an honor which was passed up by the Everly Brothers and Elvis, the single released to instant success. Suddenly, Roy wasn't the obscure failed musician anymore, and listeners fell in love with him. But while he rose higher, someone close to him only felt miserable. In just a few months, Roy had gone from struggling to success and released his next single, Blue Angel. Before long, this new fame had him traveling all over on tour, which naturally impacted his family life. Claudette stayed home with their son, and people began to talk, spreading rumors of Roy's infidelity. Even the subject matter of his music hinted that there may have been trouble in paradise. As a musician, Roy was constantly evolving, and quickly found that his latest few hits were too familiar for him. Wanting to divert from his previous works, pop style, he wrote the 1961 rock ballad, Running Scared. Ironically, the songs follow a man who worried about his girlfriend being unfaithful. While recording this, one unforgettable incident demonstrated the strength of his talent. Roy sang among an entire orchestra when recording Running Scared, and as the other musicians could only play so quietly, he needed to sing louder. This proved difficult during a certain falsetto note, and after 2 attempts where his voice broke under the strain, he chose to sing a natural high A instead. He proceeded to nail it, stunning everyone in the room. It was this voice that led to his international fame. In the next 2 years, Roy pumped out even more hits following the success of Running Scared, his first song to reach #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. This prestige led to more appearances, including more worldwide tours. During one of these tours in Australia, a local DJ started calling Roy the Big O, referencing the strong finishes to his ballads. Back home, shortly after he had begun working on Blue Angel, Roy had moved his wife and son to a suburb in Nashville. Only a couple of years later, he and Claudette would also welcome another child. Their second son, Anthony King, was born in 1962, but Roy wasn't the most present father. In 1963, UK organizers offered Roy a spot to tour alongside the Beatles. After accepting and flying over, Roy was in for a rude awakening that he wasn't the only crowd favorite. This culminated when an exasperated Roy asked, "What's a Beatles anyways?" before feeling John Lennon tap him on the shoulder and reply, "I am." Luckily, this tension didn't persist through the tour. During the tour, the Beatles stood shocked at the crazed reception UK crowds had for Roy, who goaded him into 14 encores on their opening night. Fortunately, this didn't evolve into bitterness, and Roy's initial annoyance didn't last. In fact, Roy got along famously with the Fab Four, especially since they'd already been fans of his. All the while, someone else was falling out of love with Roy. As was common for many musicians in Roy's position, his constant touring and turbulent lifestyle caused his personal life to break down. He allegedly had several hidden romances, one of which became evident to Claudette while Roy was on tour in 1963. Devastatingly, she discovered a letter penned by one of her husband's mistresses. Due to this, and her increasing loneliness, she began an affair with the man who built their home. Roy wasn't aware of any of this yet, and Claudette was still involved in his life when he was home. Roy's inspiration came from even the most mundane instances. In 1964, when he and musician Bill Dees were brainstorming a new song, Claudette stopped in, and Roy inquired if she had money on her. Dees responded that a pretty woman never needs any money, inspiring them to write Oh, Pretty Woman, which reached #1 in America and the UK and sold 7 million copies. Despite their appearances, Roy and Claudette were only doing worse. Roy and Claudette's issues came to a head in late 1964 when Roy learned of his wife's affair. Although he wasn't exactly the pinnacle of marital fidelity, this pushed Roy over the edge, and he stated the following year that he and Claudette had divorced. This didn't last long, and the two got back together after welcoming their third child, Wesley, the very same year. Roy had more drastic changes in store, however. Around the mid-1960s, Roy experienced a staggering industry shift that proved detrimental to his career. He continued releasing moderately successful singles, but none reached the same heights that he was used to. The biggest factor in this switch was the British invasion movement, whose radical new sound attracted listeners away from Roy and other musicians like him. Sadly, this wasn't the worst of it. One of the things that Roy and Claudette bonded over was a mutual love of motorcycles. Even wilder, it was Elvis himself who sparked their interest in motorcycles in the first place. However, this passion would lead to one of his greatest losses. While riding their bikes home on June 6, 1966, Claudette became involved in a severe crash with a pickup driver that had her rushed to the hospital. Tragically, she succumbed to her injuries and passed at just 25 years old. Trying to cope and distract himself, Roy explored different avenues. Around the same time, MGM signed Roy to work on music for their films, and to star in 5 of them. Roy's first was The Fastest Guitar Alive, which he tried to divert all his attention to in the wake of his wife's passing. While he thought it was great, the film received poor critical and box office reception, prompting MGM to cancel his subsequent roles. His music also became more and more obscure. As the 1960s progressed, Roy's music fell only further out of favor, especially due to some of the newer music taking the spotlight. Just like the British invasion, and working in close parallel, the counterculture movement diminished the popularity of Roy's work. Instead, artists like Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, and the Rolling Stones rose up. Sadly, the tragedies just kept on coming. As if losing his wife wasn't enough, in the fall of 1968, Roy endured another shocking tragedy. While on tour in Britain, he received news that his home in Tennessee had burned down. Much more devastating, the fire had taken the lives of his 2 eldest children, Roy and Anthony. Needless to say, this destroyed any motivation to continue in music. Looking for comfort, Roy found it in the arms of someone else. It had been 2 years since Roy lost his wife, which he filled with several other romances, albeit short ones. This was until his 1968 British tour, where he unfortunately committed himself to another young woman. He and 16-year-old Barbara Wellhonan started seeing each other on and off until they eventually got serious. Roy married Barbara in 1969, but regrettably didn't return to fathering his one surviving child. He had long since left his and Claudette's third son, Wesley, in the care of his parents. While the rock star started another family with Barbara in 1970 and later in 1975, she gave birth to Roy and Alexander Orbison. After the birth of Alexander, Roy started seeing some more negative changes. Towards the late 1970s, Roy started losing more than just his public acclaim, as his health began to suffer. In 1977, while vacationing in Hawaii, he went to the hospital and learned how dire his situation really was. The doctor realized that his coronary arteries had become obstructed, so much so that it was a miracle he was still alive. Sadly, this didn't change much about his lifestyle. Roy would survive these initial health issues, but only due to an open heart surgery he received a few months later in January 1978. This near-fatal event did little to sway him from his usual rock star antics, and he saw the surgery as little more than a refreshing procedure before he resumed his unhealthy habits. While his success in America had dropped, it wasn't the same in other countries. Going into the early 1980s, Roy had become a thing of the past in America, with any new singles falling flat and him fading into the industry's background. However, in other, more unexpected countries, his work flourished. For instance, fans in Bulgaria were chomping at the bit for his performances, in a frenzy similar to his peak in the 1960s. No matter how his commercial success ebbed and flowed, his contributions were undeniable. Finally, toward the end of the 80s, America remembered how beloved Roy became during his time in the spotlight. In 1987, he received 2 honors, being inducted into the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The latter was by Bruce Springsteen, who spoke of how great inspiration Roy's voice had on later musicians. Following this, he discovered another source of inspiration. For exclusive perks like early access to new videos, priority replies to your comments, and to have your say on future content, consider becoming a Factor-Nape member. On top of that, your support helps keep the channel going. Click the link in the description for more details. Possibly Roy Orbison's greatest claim to fame was the creation of the most famous supergroup in history. While having lunch in 1987 with Jeff Lynne of Electric Light Orchestra and George Harrison, Roy agreed to a collaboration on Harrison's Imagination. They then enlisted Tom Petty and Bob Dylan, and all came together to form the Traveling Wilburys. This wasn't just any run-of-the-mill group, though. Rather than success or talent, Harrison stated the most important factor in choosing members was who you could hang out with. Once formed, the Traveling Wilburys focused on having fun with their music above all else. Part of this involved taking stage names, with Roy adopting the persona of Lefty Wilbury, inspired by his role model, Lefty Frizzle. Especially within this group, Roy was met with appreciation. Each Traveling Wilburys member had come from great renown, and Roy was lucky enough to find a group of esteemed colleagues who greatly admired him. Even though they were all friends and could get along simply hanging out and having a laugh, Jeff Lynne would later state that once Roy started singing, he profoundly affected everyone who heard. Sadly, his story was almost over. In 1988, around the same time that Roy finished his solo comeback album Mystery Girl, he started experiencing serious chest pain. After taking another European trip and enduring a slate of long interviews, he also complained of severe headaches. Others could tell Roy was descending into an intense sickness, but he continued to perform and make appearances. Still, this only grew worse. In late 1988, just a couple of weeks before Christmas, Roy's life sadly came to an end. Following dinner with his friend on December 6th, he visited his mom's house and spent some time with his son Wesley before taking a bathroom break. After he didn't come out for half an hour, his family discovered him on the floor. Though emergency services were contacted, it was already too late. Roy ultimately perished from a heart attack. As a bit of silver lining, he didn't end his career in obscurity. For someone who experienced the chaotic highs and lows of the music industry firsthand, Roy was lucky enough to end on a high note. His album, Mystery Girl, which released after his passing, broke his previous records and symbolized the fond memories many had of him. In fact, it charted the highest of all his solo albums at number 5.